A man built a house on the edge of nowhere and left one chair empty for a woman he had never met. His neighbors called him a fool. His family called him stubborn. And for 2 years that chair sat on the porch through blizzards, through drought, through the kind of silence that breaks ordinary men. But Silas Mercer wasn't ordinary. He was something rarer, a man who decided, before he ever found her, that he would wait. This is the story of the chair that started a life, and the woman brave enough to sit in it. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The hammer came down wrong. Silas Mercer felt it before he heard it. That sick half-second where the body knows something bad has happened before the brain catches up. The nail bent sideways, and the wooden beam he'd been trying to anchor to the east wall of his roof shifted 2 inches to the left, groaning like something alive. He grabbed it with both hands, bare palms against raw pine, and held on. For a long moment, he just hung there on top of his half-finished house, 300 pounds of structural timber threatening to slide off into the dirt, the September wind cutting across the Kansas prairie like it had a personal grudge against him. "You gonna fall?" called a voice from below. Silas didn't look down. He couldn't afford to look down. "No," he said through his teeth. "Looks like you're gonna fall. Holt, if you don't get up here and grab this beam, I'm going to nail your boots to this porch when I'm done." There was a pause. Then the creak of a ladder. Then the substantial, reliable weight of Holt Granger, 6'2", 230 pounds of Norwegian-German stubbornness, appeared at the roofline and got his shoulder under the timber. Together they eased it back into position. Silas drove 3 nails in fast, not caring if they were perfect, just needing it to hold. When the beam settled and stopped moving, he sat back on his heels and let himself breathe. Below him, the Kansas prairie spread out in every direction like a painting that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The sky was enormous. That was the thing about Kansas that nobody who hadn't stood in the middle of it could ever really understand. The sky wasn't just above you. It was around you, pressing in from all sides, so wide and so blue and so utterly indifferent to human problems that it made a man feel both small and strangely free. The land itself was golden and flat and brutal. There was beauty in it, but it wasn't the soft, inviting kind. It was the beauty of something that would kill you if you forgot to respect it. Silas had been here 2 years. 2 years since he'd filed his claim, driven his stake into the ground, and started the long, grinding process of turning raw prairie into something that might, one day, be called a home. He was 31 years old. His hands were already scarred from wire fencing and rough wood. There was a callus on his right palm that hadn't been there 3 years ago. His back ached in the mornings in a way it hadn't in his 20s. He wasn't old, but the frontier had a way of adding years to a man that had nothing to do with the calendar. "Good roof," Holt said, sitting on the ridgeline beside him, surveying the work. "It's crooked. It'll keep the rain out. The north corner dips." "Silas!" Holt looked at him with the patient exasperation of a man who had watched his neighbor rebuild the same porch railing 4 times because it wasn't level enough. "It's a house. On the prairie. In Kansas. It doesn't need to be a cathedral." "I know what it needs to be." Holt followed Silas's gaze down to the front of the house, where the porch ran the full width of the building. It was, without question, the best-built part of the structure. Solid, level, smooth planked, with 2 posts that Silas had spent an entire afternoon getting perfectly plumb. And on that porch, side by side, facing the western horizon where the sun was already starting to think about setting, sat 2 wooden chairs, both of them empty. Holt was quiet for a moment. "You still got both chairs out there," he said. "I know. The Hendersons' eldest daughter asked about you again. Clara. She's a good woman, Silas, hard worker." "I know Clara Henderson is a good woman." "Then why—" "Because I'm not looking for a good worker," Silas said. He picked up his hammer again, turned it over in his hands. "I can do the work. I need someone who—" He stopped. "It's hard to explain." Holt looked at him for a long moment, the way men on the frontier sometimes looked at each other when they were trying to figure out if the other person had started losing their mind. It happened out here. The isolation got into people, made them strange. But Silas's eyes were clear, tired, sure, weathered, but clear. "You wrote that letter yet?" Holt asked. Silas didn't answer right away. "I'm writing it," he said. He wrote it over the course of 11 days. This was not because he was a slow writer. Silas Mercer had finished school at 16, had read every book his mother owned twice, had a mind that ran fast and organized itself clearly. He could hammer out a letter when he needed to. Business letters, land office correspondence, the occasional note to his brother in Ohio. These he wrote quickly, practically, without sentiment. But this letter was different, and he knew it from the start. He sat at his kitchen table in the evenings, after the day's work was done, with a kerosene lamp throwing orange light across the page, and he tried to write an honest account of himself. The first draft was too cheerful. He read it back and felt embarrassed by it. It sounded like a man trying to sell a horse. Hardworking, healthy, owns good land, comfortable home in progress. True, all of it, but it felt like a lie by omission, leaving out everything that mattered. The second draft was too grim. He'd tried to correct for the cheerfulness by being direct about the hardships, and ended up with something that read like a warning label. The winters are brutal. The work is unending. Loneliness is the constant companion of anyone who lives out here. All of that was true too, but who would read that and want to come? Someone honest, maybe? He stared at that thought for a while. The third draft, he stopped trying to write an advertisement. He started trying to write the truth. My name is Silas Mercer. I am 31 years old and I have lived on this land in Barton County, Kansas for 2 years. I came here because I believed I could build something, and I still believe that, though I understand better now what it costs. The land is beautiful in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The sky here is unlike any sky I've seen. In the spring, the wildflowers come in so thick you can't take a step without crushing them. In winter, the snow falls without sound and covers everything. And for an hour after a snowfall, the world is perfectly still, and you feel like maybe you're the last man alive. And somehow that's not as terrible as it sounds. The work is hard. That's not a complaint. I knew what I was signing up for. But the honest truth is that I've built this house and this land with my hands, and most nights when I sit on the porch and watch the sun go down, I look at the chair beside me and I think about what it would mean to have someone sitting in it who chose to be there. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Not because this was the best option available. Because she looked at what I'm trying to build out here and saw something worth building alongside. I'm not looking for a housekeeper. I'm not looking for someone to make my life easier, though I'll confess there are days I'd be grateful for a second pair of hands. I'm looking for a person, a real person, with her own ideas and her own opinions and her own sense of what a life should be, who wants to build that life deliberately, who thinks about the future as something to be constructed rather than just waited for. I have 2 chairs on my porch. One of them is empty. I put it there before the house was finished because it seemed important to be honest about what I was hoping for. If any of this sounds like something you recognize, if you've ever looked at your life and felt like it was almost what you wanted, but not quite, like something important was missing without you being able to name exactly what, I'd like to hear from you. My name is Silas Mercer. I built a house on the Kansas prairie with a second chair on the porch, and I haven't given up on filling it yet. He read it back 4 times. He changed 3 words. Then he folded it and addressed it to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, and 2 Kansas City papers. He walked to the post office in town, 4 miles each way, and mailed all 4 copies on a Thursday morning in October. Then he went home and went back to work and tried not to think about it. He thought about it constantly. Vivian Hartwell read the advertisement on a Tuesday in November during her lunch break, at a wooden table in the corner of the print shop where she had worked since she was 17. She was 28 years old. She had ink under her fingernails that never quite came out, no matter how hard she scrubbed. She was not beautiful in the way that Philadelphia society defined beautiful. Her face was angular. Her expression was typically one of focused concentration. And she had a habit of saying exactly what she thought that had not endeared her to the kind of men who'd come calling over the years. She was a compositor. Her job was to set type, to arrange individual letters backwards and in mirror image into lines and blocks of text that would eventually be pressed onto paper and become the printed word. It was meticulous, demanding work that required both precision and speed, and she was very good at it. She read constantly. This was partly professional habit and partly genuine hunger. She had an appetite for information that the print shop, with its daily parade of text on every subject imaginable, did a reasonable job of feeding. She read everything that came through: news, fiction, agricultural reports, legal notices, society gossip, obituaries, and advertisements. Most of the matrimonial advertisements were pathetic. She didn't mean that cruelly. She meant it factually, in the way you'd apply the word to something that inspired sympathy and a vague sadness. They were written by lonely men trying to hide how lonely they were, describing themselves in broad strokes of virtue that told you nothing real, asking for women of good character and domestic skill, as if they were ordering a piece of furniture. She usually skimmed them. This one stopped her halfway through the first sentence. She read it once, quickly. Then she set it down and ate 3 bites of her bread and looked out the window at the gray November street. Then she picked it up and read it again, slowly. Not because she had nowhere else to go, she sat with that for a moment. Her life in Philadelphia was not bad. It was important to be honest about that. She had work she was skilled at and moderately proud of. She had friends, Margaret from church, Eleanor who lived 2 streets over, the Kowalski sisters from the shop floor. She had a comfortable routine. She had a room in her parents' house that she'd lived in all her life, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light nicely. She also had, in the back of her mind at odd hours, the persistent and slightly uncomfortable feeling that the life she was living was not quite the life she was supposed to be living. She couldn't say why. She couldn't point to anything specific that was wrong. Nothing was wrong. That was almost the problem. Everything was fine, and fine was starting to feel like its own kind of trap. She read the advertisement a 3rd time. Who thinks about the future as something to be constructed rather than just waited for? She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went back to work. That evening, at the kitchen table after supper, while her mother sewed and her father read and the familiar sounds of the Philadelphia house moved around her like water, Vivian Hartwell took out a sheet of paper and began to write. She wrote for an hour. She threw away the first version. She wrote for another 40 minutes. She did not write a response to an advertisement. She wrote a letter to someone she didn't know, saying things she had never said out loud. She mailed it on Wednesday morning. Silas got her letter on a Friday afternoon in December, 3 weeks after he'd mailed his own. He'd gotten other responses. 4 of them, if he was counting, which he was. 2 had been polite and brief and essentially non-committal. 1 had been from a widow in Missouri with 6 children who seemed to be looking primarily for financial stability, which Silas respected but which wasn't what he was offering. 1 had been strange enough that he'd burned it. He read Vivian's letter standing in the post office, because he'd opened it on his way out and then stopped moving. The postmaster, old Ben Cawley, looked up from his sorting. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," Silas said. He turned the letter over, checked the return address, turned it back. "Yeah." He walked home faster than usual. She'd written about her work, which surprised him. Most women, he'd imagined, would have started with their personal qualities, their household skills, the things they thought he'd want to know. Vivian started with the print shop, not describing it neutrally, but thinking about it, analyzing it, writing about the way language worked when it was made physical, when the words you arranged on a page went out into the world and became something thousands of people read and were changed by, even slightly. "There's something that happens when you set a line of type," she'd written, "that I've never been able to explain to anyone who doesn't do it. You hold the letters in your hand, backwards, and you build the sentence from left to right, but read it from right to left, and somewhere in between you stop seeing individual letters and start seeing meaning. The whole thing reverses itself. I think about that sometimes, about how much of understanding is just learning to read things backwards." He read that paragraph 3 times. She'd also written about the city, not with pride or defensiveness, but with the clear eye of someone who saw a thing clearly because she'd been looking at it her whole life. She wrote about the noise, the smell, the press of bodies, the way a city moved with its own logic that you either learned or got crushed by. She wrote about the freedom of it and the smallness of it at the same time. She wrote about feeling, occasionally, like she was standing in a very crowded room and somehow still alone. And then she wrote, "Your letter mentioned building a life deliberately. I'd like to know what you mean by that. Not the frontier part. I understand working for something. I mean the deliberate part. What does it look like, the life you're trying to build? Not the farm. The life." Silas sat down at his table and started writing back that same evening. He meant to write a short letter. He wrote 8 pages. They wrote to each other for 7 months. This is the bare fact of it, and bare facts rarely contain the things that matter. So here is what those 7 months actually looked like. There were 34 letters total, 18 from Silas, 16 from Vivian, the imbalance explained by the fact that Vivian's were considerably longer. She had a compositor's relationship with words. She didn't use them loosely, but when she committed to a subject, she went deep. In February, they argued. It was the first real argument, the first time either of them wrote something that made the other person genuinely angry, and the way they each handled it said more about them than all the pleasant exchanges before it. Silas had written in a letter about the organization of the farm, a casual aside about how he imagined the household side of things would be managed once he had a partner, phrased in a way that assumed a fairly traditional division of labor, because that was what he knew, what he'd grown up with, what everyone around him did. Vivian's response arrived 3 weeks later. I noticed that you wrote about the household side of things as if it were a separate category from the farm. I'm curious about this division. On the practical level, I understand it. Someone has to manage the domestic work and someone has to manage the fields. But I wonder if you've thought about which category that division puts me in. I'm not asking this to start a fight. I'm asking because I've spent 11 years in a print shop doing work that most people assume men do, and I have some opinions about categories. Silas read that letter twice, quickly, with the particular tight feeling in his chest that he recognized as defensiveness. He sat with that feeling for a day, genuinely sat with it, which was something he was better at than most men, the ability to hold discomfort without immediately acting on it. Then he wrote back, "You're right, and I was sloppy. I wrote that the way I write most things out here, from habit, not from thought. I've been thinking about what you said for 2 days, and I think what I actually want is a partner who's involved in the whole thing, the fields and the books and the decisions and the problems. I've just never seen that modeled, so I defaulted to what I know. I'm not sure I'll always get it right, but I'll keep trying to think it through." Vivian read that letter standing in the post office, because she'd gotten into the habit of opening his letters immediately, unable to wait. She stood there for a while. Then she wrote him back that same afternoon, breaking her usual rhythm of letting his letters sit for a few days before responding, and wrote, "That's the most honest thing a man has ever said to me. I should probably be embarrassed by how much that means." After that, something shifted. The letters became less careful. They wrote about things that were harder to write about. Silas's complicated feelings about his father, who had died 6 years ago, and left him a tangle of grief and unresolved argument that he'd never really talked through with anyone. Vivian's anger at the limits placed on women in her field, the way she'd trained 3 men who had then been promoted over her, the way she'd learned to perform a kind of cheerful indifference that cost her something each time. They wrote about books. They argued about books. They agreed about books in ways that felt electric. In May, Silas wrote, "I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit I mean it. Have you given any serious thought to coming out here? Not as a question of commitment. I know we're not there yet, but as a real possibility, something you're actually considering." Vivian's response took 4 weeks, which was the longest gap in their correspondence. When it arrived, it was 3 pages long. Yes, it began. "I've been considering it since February." The rest of the letter was an honest accounting of everything that scared her about it. The distance, the isolation, the uncertainty, the sheer physical difficulty of frontier life, which she was clear-eyed enough to know she didn't fully understand. She wrote about what she'd be leaving, the work she was good at, her friends, her family, the world she knew how to navigate. And then she wrote, "But I think about that second chair. I think about what you said, about building a life deliberately. I've spent 28 years living a life that happened to me, and I think I might be ready to go live one I chose." Silas read that in his kitchen, late at night, the lamp burning low. He put the letter down and looked out the window at the dark prairie. Then he sat down and started writing the most careful letter he'd ever written in his life. It was a Tuesday in early June when Vivian came home from work and found her mother in the front parlor, sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, wearing the expression of someone who has been holding a terrible thing inside themselves for hours. "Sit down, Vivian." "What happened?" "Sit down." Vivian sat. Her father, Arthur Hartwell, had collapsed at his business partner's office that morning. By the time the doctor arrived, he was conscious but couldn't speak, couldn't form the words, couldn't get his right hand to do what he told it to. The doctor said he said some things in a lowered voice to Vivian's mother that her mother later relayed to Vivian in a stripped-down, flat-voice summary that left out the emotion because there was no room for emotion right now. There was only what needed to be done. Arthur Hartwell was 49 years old. He ran a printing business. Not the same shop where Vivian worked, but a related enterprise, commercial printing, business forms, stationery. He'd built it himself over 20 years, and it could not run without him unless someone stepped in. There was, in the Hartwell family, exactly one person with the knowledge, the skill, and the experience to step in. Vivian went to the shop the next morning and told her supervisor she needed an indefinite leave. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized how much he's been taking for granted. She wrote Silas that evening, "My father has had a stroke. He's alive, but his speech and movement are affected. I don't know yet how much will come back. I'm needed here. I don't know for how long." She held the pen over the paper for a long moment and then added, "I'm not asking you to wait. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't know what this means or how long it will take. I think you should know that, and I think you should make whatever decision makes sense for your life. But I also want you to know that I think about that chair every single day." She sealed the letter and put it in her coat pocket to mail in the morning. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a while, not moving, listening to her father's slow, effortful breathing from the bedroom down the hall. Silas's response arrived 2.5 weeks later. She opened it at the kitchen table after dinner while her mother was washing up and her father was asleep. It was one page. "Vivian, I'm sorry about your father. I hope he recovers well. I understand completely what you need to do, and I wouldn't want you to be anywhere other than where you're needed. As for the other thing, I'm not going anywhere. That chair isn't going anywhere either. I put it there for a reason, and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. Take the time you need. I'll be here. Silas." Vivian read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the small wooden box under her bed where she kept all his letters. Then she got up, washed her face, and went back to work. The months that followed were the kind that don't make good stories but make real lives. Hard, repetitive, exhausting, in the particular way of work that has no clear ending point. Vivian ran her father's print shop. This was not a romantic undertaking. It meant arriving before anyone else and leaving after everyone else. It meant learning, quickly, the parts of the business she'd never had to know. The supplier negotiations, the payroll, the contracts, the client relationships. It meant making decisions she wasn't sure about and then living with the consequences. Her father, Arthur, made slow and partial progress. By September, he could speak again, haltingly. Short sentences. Certain words still stuck behind whatever the stroke had put in the way. His right hand trembled. He couldn't stand for long. He sat in the kitchen in the mornings and watched Vivian get ready for work with an expression that she found almost unbearable to look at. A man who had built something and could no longer tend it himself. "You're good at it," he said one morning in November, out of nowhere. The words came slowly, but they came. Vivian looked up from her coat buttons. "What?" "The shop." He moved his left hand slightly. The good hand. "You're good at it." She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "I learned from watching you because it was true and because she wanted to give him something." He looked at her for a long time. "The letters," he said, "from Kansas." She went still. "Your mother told me," he said. He wasn't accusatory. He was, she searched for the right word, careful, like a man approaching something breakable. "Is it, He paused, searched. "Real?" "Yes," she said. "Do you want to go?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes." He nodded, said nothing for a while. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a cart went by on the street. "I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not a reason to— Stay, if you want to go." "You're my father." "Yes." He met her eyes. "And you're my daughter. Not my—" He struggled. "Not my property." It was the longest speech he'd made since the stroke. It cost him something. She could see it. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand over his left hand, the good one. She didn't go to Kansas. Not then. There was still too much unresolved, too much that depended on her being there. But she wrote Silas a letter that night that she hadn't known she needed to write, about her father, about what he'd said. about what it meant to love someone and also want your own life, and about how those two things could both be true at once, without either one canceling the other out. Meanwhile, out on the Kansas prairie, Silas was having his own kind of hard year. The summer had been dry, not catastrophically, but enough to make every day a calculation. He'd lost a third of his wheat crop. The well had needed repairing, which had cost him 3 weeks of labor and money he hadn't planned to spend. One of his 2 horses had gone lame in August and recovered slowly. His neighbors, who had always found his situation faintly amusing, the bachelor homesteader with the empty chair, the advertisement that everyone in the county had heard about, had shifted over the course of the year from amusement to something closer to concern. "It's been a year," Holt said one evening, sitting on Silas's porch. The 2 chairs were between them, both still empty. "More than a year. I'm aware of that. I'm not saying it's wrong," Holt said carefully. He was a careful man, Holt. He'd learned over years of friendship that Silas didn't respond well to direct pressure, but he also didn't like things left unsaid. "I'm just saying, she's still in Philadelphia. Her father had a stroke." "I know. I'm saying, you've sent her, what, 8 letters since then?" "9. And she's written back. Everyone." Holt was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun was dropping fast in the way Kansas suns dropped. No gradual fade, just a slide from gold to pink to purple in what felt like minutes. "You're sure she's real?" he said. Not meanly. "I mean, she's not just letters are... She's real," Silas said. "You've never met her." "I know her better than I know most people I see every week." Holt chewed on that. "That's either very true or very sad," he finally said. "Maybe both," Silas said. They watched the sun go down. "I'm not giving up on it," Silas said after a while, "if that's what you're asking." "I'm not asking you to." "People keep acting like waiting is the same as being foolish." "People out here don't have a lot of patience for waiting," Holt said. "It's a frontier, it runs on doing. Some things can't be rushed." Silas looked at the empty chair. "I put that chair there for a reason. I'm not going to take it in just because it's been a year." Holt stood up, stretched his back. "All right," he said simply. And that was that. But the truth was, and Silas was honest enough with himself to admit it, in the long, dark hours of the prairie evenings, the waiting did cost him something. There were nights when he sat on that porch alone and felt not hopeful, but hollow. When the distance between Kansas and Philadelphia felt not like something bridgeable, but like a permanent condition, like a fact of geography that no letter could change. When he looked at the empty chair and felt, for a few minutes, genuinely stupid about all of it. He didn't write to Vivian about those nights. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he wanted to be, for her, the person who was steady and certain when she was navigating so much uncertainty herself. Maybe because he was afraid that if he admitted how hard the waiting was, he'd start to believe he should stop. He wrote her about other things instead. The repair of the well, the way the prairie looked after rain, the smell of it, the particular green that came up from nowhere in a landscape that seemed all brown and gold, a book he'd read, a funny argument he'd had with Holt about fence posts, small things, real things. She wrote back about small things too, her father's progress, a new typeface they'd gotten at the shop that she found beautiful, a conversation she'd had with a woman on the street that had stuck with her for days, for reasons she couldn't quite explain. They were, Silas thought, building something, even across that impossible distance. They were building something with words, the way Vivian built things with type, one piece at a time, backwards and in mirror image, trusting that it would come out right when pressed. He held on to that thought on the hard nights. It was all he had, some of those nights, but he held on to it. By the spring of 1881, Vivian had been running her father's print shop for nearly a year. She was good at it. This was not a small thing to acknowledge, and she'd spent a while not acknowledging it. There had been something that felt like betrayal in being good at something she hadn't chosen, something that was keeping her from the thing she had chosen. But the two things were both true, and she'd eventually made her peace with that. Her father was better. Not recovered. The stroke had left permanent marks, a slight drag in his speech, a weakness on his right side that the doctors said was likely permanent, but functional. He could come to the shop a few hours a day now. He could sign documents, give direction, hold a conversation. He was not the man he'd been before, but he was back, mostly. And in that mostly, a door had started to open. Vivian looked at it carefully, the way she approached most things. She assessed it before she walked through it. She thought about what would need to be in place for it to work. A person who could manage the shop without her. Not a replacement for her. That would be too much to ask. But someone who could handle the daily operations, who knew the business well enough, who could be trusted. She thought about who that might be. Young Thomas Ackerman had worked the shop floor for 4 years. He was 24, quick, reliable, with a genuine interest in the mechanics of the business that went beyond just doing his job. She'd watched him over the past year, watched him pay attention to things he didn't have to pay attention to, ask questions he didn't have to ask. She'd started, carefully and without announcement, giving him more responsibility. He hadn't dropped any of it. She wrote Silas a letter in March. "I think I might be figuring something out," she wrote. "I can't make promises yet. There are too many pieces that aren't settled. But I want you to know that I'm not just waiting anymore. I'm actively working toward something. I think that matters, even if I can't tell you yet exactly what it looks like." His response came back in 2.5 weeks. "It matters," he wrote. "Take your time. Do it right. The chair is still there." And then, because Vivian would later remember this as the moment she understood exactly who she was dealing with, he added, "I've been thinking about the porch. The planks on the east side need replacing. They've been bad since last winter. I've been putting it off because it seemed like something we should probably do together, but I think I'll go ahead and do it now. It'll be ready when you get here." She read that sentence 4 times. It'll be ready when you get here. Not if. Not should you ever. Just when. She put the letter down, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, breathed. Then she went downstairs and asked Thomas Ackerman if he had a few minutes, because she wanted to talk to him about the future of the shop. The conversation with Thomas took an hour and a half. She was honest with him in the way she'd learned to be honest with people who deserved it, directly, without softening the hard parts. "I may be leaving," she said. "Not immediately, but eventually. I'm not saying this to alarm you or to create instability. I'm saying it because if that happens, I want there to be a plan, and I want you to be part of it." Thomas looked at her steadily. He was young, but he had steady eyes. "Where are you going?" "Kansas." A pause. "The letters?" She'd forgotten for a moment that the letters were not a secret she'd kept well. Print shops were small. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "When would this happen?" "I don't know. It depends on things that are still uncertain. My father. The business." She met his eyes. "You." He understood what she was saying. "You'd want me to be able to run it. I'd want to know that it could keep running," she said. "That my father would be taken care of. That everything I spent the last year building doesn't fall apart." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a lot to ask." "I know. I'm 24. "I know." "Why me?" She thought about it. "Because you pay attention to things you don't have to pay attention to," she said. "Because you've been learning this place even when no one asked you to. Because I think you want it." He looked at his hands, at the ink under his own nails, which matched hers. Then he looked up. "Tell me what I'd need to know," he said. She began to teach him everything. Silas replaced the porch boards in April. He did it on a Saturday, working alone, the way he did most things, methodically, without hurry, taking out the rotten planks one at a time and fitting the new ones with care. He was particular about the fit. He used good wood, better than he strictly needed to. He wanted it to last. When he was done, he stood back and looked at the porch, at the 2 chairs, at the new boards under them, pale and clean against the weathered older wood. "Nice work," said a voice behind him. He turned. It was Clara Henderson. Not Holt this time, but Clara herself, who had apparently walked over from her family's property to the north. She was carrying a covered dish, which she held out to him with the directness that he'd always appreciated about her. "Mother made extra," she said. "She figured you were working today and wouldn't have cooked." "She's right," he said. "Thank you." He took the dish. They stood there for a moment in the way of 2 people who've known each other a few years but never gotten past a certain polite distance. Clara looked at the chairs. She'd always been careful not to look at them in all his interactions with her. Today, for some reason, she didn't bother. "She's not coming," Clara said. Not cruelly, just directly. It was a trait of hers. She is, Silas said. You don't know that. I know her. Silas. Clara turned to face him. She was a handsome woman, fair-haired, with her mother's practical eyes. You're a good man. You're building something real here. You deserve a real life, not a correspondence. He looked at her for a moment. I understand why that looks foolish from the outside, he said. It doesn't look foolish. It looks sad, maybe. He looked back at the chairs. But I know what I've built with her in those letters, Clara. I know what kind of mind she has and what she cares about and what she's willing to fight for. That's not nothing. That's more than a lot of people have after years of marriage. But you don't know if she's... Clara stopped. If she's what I think she is in person? He said it for her. No, I don't. But I also don't know that she isn't. He shifted the dish in his hands. Thank you for the food. Tell your mother I'm grateful. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and walked back across the prairie. Silas went inside, sat down, and wrote Vivian a letter. He told her about this porch. He told her about Clara, which he'd never done before. He'd been careful not to mention the women his neighbors periodically suggested, not wanting Vivian to feel pressure, not wanting her to feel that there was competition or a clock. But that afternoon, for some reason, it felt important to be transparent. A neighbor came by today and told me you're probably not coming, he wrote. She's not wrong that it's a possibility I should consider. She was trying to be kind, I think, but I sat with what she said and I couldn't make it change anything. I still think you're coming. I still think this is what it is. I realize that might make me seem like a man who can't face facts. But I think there are different kinds of facts. There are the facts that exist right now, and the facts that are still becoming. I believe in the second kind. I also want to say something I should have said earlier. If you decide you can't come, if the timing is wrong or the distance is too much, or you look at all of it and decide it isn't what you want, I'll understand. I won't be all right away, but I'll understand. You don't owe me your life just because we've written each other letters. But I hope you come. He sealed the letter, addressed it, walked to town. When he got back, he sat in his chair, the left one, the one he'd always taken, and looked at the empty chair beside him. The prairie was quiet, the evening birds were starting. Somewhere to the west, a coyote called once and went silent. He sat there until dark. The letter arrived on a Thursday in August. Vivian read it standing in the post office, as she always did, because she could never make herself wait. She read it once. Then she walked back to the print shop, nodded to Thomas, hung up her coat, and sat down at her compositing station. She set type for 3 hours. She did it automatically, her hands finding the letters by feel and habit, the way they'd been trained over 11 years. Then she stopped, set down the typestick, looked at her hands. She thought about what Silas had written, not the second half, the graceful, generous release he'd offered her, the "you don't owe me your life," which she'd read and felt the full weight of. But the first part, the "I still think you're coming," the absolute, undefended certainty of it. She thought about her father, who was better, who could come to the shop every day now, who had sat across from her at dinner last week and asked, unprompted, if she'd written to Kansas lately, with a look in his eye that wasn't sorrow but something more complicated. A father coming to terms with something, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. She thought about Thomas, who had been running the shop floor nearly independently for 3 months, who had made 2 decisions without consulting her last week that she would have made exactly the same way. She thought about the second chair. She thought about it with the specificity of someone who had spent 2 years imagining it, the wood of it, the prairie light around it, the horizon it faced. She thought about what it would mean to get on a train and cross the country and walk toward a person she'd never met but knew, somehow, in a way she trusted more than she could justify. She thought about what she'd said in that early letter. I've spent 28 years living a life that happened to me. She was 29 now. She got up from her station, went to the back office, sat down at the desk, and wrote a letter. It was short, 4 sentences. Silas. I've made arrangements at the shop. I've spoken with my father and my mother and Thomas. I'm coming in September. She sealed it before she could second-guess herself. Then she went out front, past Thomas, who looked up from his work. It's done, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Good, he said, and he meant it. She mailed the letter on her way home. Walking back, the late August heat pressing down on the Philadelphia streets, The smell of the city all around her, coal smoke, horses, bread from the bakery on Chestnut Street. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. Something rawer than happiness and more real. She felt like a person who had made a decision. It was, she thought, a remarkable feeling. She walked home with it, through the noise and heat of the city she'd lived in her entire life, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something you've been waiting a long time for. Not too tight, not too loose, just right. 1 month. She was going in 1 month. The second chair was waiting. She was going. The letter reached Silas on a Monday. He knew it was from her before he opened it. He'd learned her handwriting the way you learn a person's voice, the particular slant of her capital S, the way she pressed harder on the downstrokes. He stood outside the post office in the flat September light and held the envelope for a moment, turning it over once, then tore it open with his thumb. He read it standing right there on the dirt road, with Ben Cawley watching him through the post office window and a wagon going by close enough to kick dust onto his boots. 4 sentences. He read them twice. Then he folded the letter, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back to his horse. He stood there with one hand on the saddle for a long moment, not moving. "Everything all right?" called Ben from the doorway. "Yeah," Silas said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yeah, everything's fine." He rode home. He didn't push the horse. He let it find its own pace across the prairie while he sat in the saddle and looked at the horizon and tried to understand what he was feeling. It wasn't quite what he'd expected. He'd imagined, if this moment came, that it would feel like relief, like something tight finally letting go. And there was some of that, but underneath it was something more complicated, something closer to fear, which surprised him. She was real. He knew that. He'd known it for 2 years. But there's a kind of knowing that lives in letters and a kind that lives in the physical world, and they were different things, and they were about to collide. He got home, unsaddled the horse, fed it. He went inside and put water on the stove. He sat at the kitchen table and read her letter again. "I'm coming in September. 3 weeks. Approximately. Depending on when in September, depending on the train, depending on 100 small logistics he didn't know yet because she hadn't said." He got up and walked out to the porch, stood there in the cooling afternoon air, looked at the 2 chairs. The new porch boards were already starting to weather slightly, losing that pale, raw look, taking on the gray-gold tone of wood that knows the outdoors. The chairs sat where they always sat, facing west, and the prairie stretched out beyond them in its enormous, indifferent way. He sat in his chair, left one, always the left, and looked at the right one. "All right," he said, to no one in particular. He sat there until it got dark. That night he wrote her back. Not a long letter. There wasn't time for long letters now, but a real one. He gave her the directions to the station in town. He told her which train lines connected where. He told her he'd be there to meet her, whatever day she arrived, and that if she'd write him the date, he'd make sure he wasn't somewhere with his hands in a fence repair when she stepped off the train. Then he added at the bottom, after he'd already thought the letter was done, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly because we've been playing with each other, and I don't want to stop now. I'm not going to pretend I'm not nervous. I think you probably are too. I think that's reasonable. We're about to find out if 2 years of letters amounts to what we think it does, and that's not a small thing. But I also want you to know that whatever happens when you get here, whatever is different from what we imagined, I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out." He sealed it and took it to town the next morning, first thing. In Philadelphia, Vivian was in the middle of her own particular chaos. Telling her mother had been the hardest part. Not because her mother was opposed. Margaret Hartwell was, in many ways, a practical woman who understood that daughters grew up and lives changed. But practicality and grief aren't mutually exclusive, and her mother sat at the kitchen table after Vivian told her and was quiet for a long time, looking at her hands. "September," her mother said finally. "Yes, that's soon." "I know." Her mother looked up. "You're sure?" "Yes," Vivian said. And she was. She was sure in the way you can be sure about something that also frightens you, which is the only kind of sure that means anything. Her mother nodded. She reached across the table and patted Vivian's hand once, briefly, the way she'd always expressed affection, economically, not with less feeling, but with fewer words. "He'd better have a good house," she said. "He built it himself," Vivian said. "He's very particular about things being level." Her mother actually smiled at that, A small one, but real. But her father was harder. Not because he objected. He'd essentially given her his blessing months ago, in the halting way his speech now came, and she didn't think he'd take it back. But sitting across from him at dinner the evening she told him she'd booked the train, watching him absorb it, she felt the full weight of what she was doing in a way she hadn't quite felt before. He listened. He asked no questions while she explained the logistics. When she was leaving, what Thomas would be managing, what she'd arranged with the suppliers, the system she'd put in place to make sure someone wrote him with the weekly numbers. He listened to all of it, and when she finished, he was quiet. "Dad," she started. "You've thought of everything," he said. Slowly but clearly. "I've tried. You've taken care of," he searched for the word, "everything, like you always do. I wanted to make sure things were settled before I—" "Vivian," he stopped her. His left hand moved on the table. "Stop explaining. I understand. I'm not—" He paused, gathered himself. "I'm proud of you. That's all I wanted to say." She didn't cry. She came close. She held it in through the kind of stubborn will she'd had since childhood, the same quality that had gotten her through 11 years of being the most competent person in a room full of men who didn't want to admit it. "Thank you," she said. "Go," he said simply. "Go and don't look back so much." It was the most he'd said in a single conversation since the stroke. She packed over the following 2 weeks with the systematic thoroughness that characterized everything she did. 2 large trunks. Books. She debated which ones and ultimately brought more than was practical because she wasn't prepared to negotiate on books. Practical clothing, because she'd read enough about frontier life to know that what worked in Philadelphia would not work in Kansas. Her compositing tools, though she had no compositing work waiting for her in Kansas, she brought them anyway because they were part of who she was, and she wasn't leaving that behind. She also brought, carefully wrapped in cloth and packed in the center of the smaller trunk, a framed photograph of her parents taken 2 years before the stroke, her father standing straight and solid in his good coat, her mother with the expression she always wore in photographs, slightly suspicious of the whole enterprise. Vivian looked at it for a long moment before she wrapped it, then wrapped it firmly and put it away. Margaret came with her to the station. They stood on the platform in the gray September morning, the train huffing and restless behind Vivian, and her mother looked at her with an expression that Vivian had never seen on her face before. Something open and unguarded that her mother usually kept very carefully managed. "Write me," her mother said, "every week. And if it's—" Her mother stopped, tried again. "If it's not what you hoped, it will be," Vivian said. And then, because she'd learned honesty from 2 years of letters, and she wasn't going to stop now, "And if it isn't exactly, I'll figure it out. I know how to figure things out." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "You do," she said, like she was confirming something she'd always known. They embraced briefly in their family's economical way. Her mother's hand pressed once between her shoulder blades. Then Vivian picked up her bag, and she got on the train. She didn't look back at the platform. Not because she didn't want to. She wanted to desperately, but because if she looked back, she would see her mother's face, and she wasn't sure she'd be able to keep moving. She found her seat. She sat down. She looked out the window at the moving city, and then the city's edge, and then the open land beginning. She'd lived in Philadelphia her entire life. She watched it disappear. The train journey west took 3 days and 2 nights, with a connection in Chicago that involved 4 hours in a waiting room that smelled of coal and other people's luggage. Vivian slept badly and ate irregularly and read more than was healthy for her eyes in the rocking, poorly lit train car. She talked to almost no one. There was a woman across the aisle traveling with 2 small children who occasionally made eye contact with Vivian in the way of mothers silently requesting solidarity, and Vivian provided it, holding a child's rubber ball that had rolled under the seat, passing it back without comment. She thought about Silas constantly. Not the letters Silas, the one she knew. She thought about the in-person version she was about to meet, the version made of voice and height and physical presence, the version whose handshake she hadn't felt, and whose face she'd only tried to imagine from the indirect clues in his writing. He'd never sent a photograph. She'd never asked for one. It had seemed like the wrong thing to ask for somehow, like it would reduce something. Now she wasn't sure that had been wise. She knew he was 33. She knew he was tall from a casual reference he'd made to ducking through a doorframe. She knew his hands were about things other people found trivial. She knew he was stubborn, in the particular way of people who've thought carefully about what they believe and won't be moved by social pressure, only by actual argument. She knew all of that. She didn't know what he smelled like, what his voice sounded like, whether he had nervous habits, whether he was the kind of person who filled silence or let it sit. 2 years of letters, and she didn't know any of the things you learn in the first 5 minutes of being in a room with someone. The train pulled into the Kansas station on a Thursday afternoon in late September. She'd written Silas the date and the time. She'd sent it 2 weeks ago. She had no way of knowing if he'd gotten it, no way of confirming, no way of anything except stepping off the train and seeing what was there. She gathered her bag from the overhead shelf. She stood up, smoothed her coat, and moved with the other passengers toward the door. The platform was smaller than she'd expected. A low wooden structure, a few benches, a water pump, a weathered station building that looked like it had been arguing with the wind for 40 years and losing slightly. Beyond it, the town. Modest, spread out, functional looking, the kind of place that existed because it needed to and didn't spend much time worrying about what it looked like. And beyond the town, the prairie. She'd read about it. She'd thought she understood it. She didn't. The scale of it was something that could not be conveyed in words, which was a remarkable thing for a woman who'd spent her life believing that words could convey almost anything. It went in every direction, flat and vast and indifferent, and the sky above it was so enormous that it seemed to press down, and she felt for a disorienting moment like a very small object that had been misplaced in a very large drawer. She stood on the platform and looked around. There were maybe 20 people waiting, meeting passengers, handling cargo. She scanned them quickly, systematically, the way she read a page of type, left to right, picking out what mattered. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at the far end of the platform, near the station building, holding his hat in his hands the way a man holds his hat when he's been holding it too long and hasn't noticed. He was tall. She'd been right about that. The doorframe reference was accurate. Dark hair, needed cutting. A coat that had been good once and was now good in the way of things that have been worked in and repaired and lived in. He was scanning the crowd the same way she was, methodically, and she had a strange double-image moment of watching him search for her while she was already watching him. He hadn't found her yet. She walked toward him. The platform boards were uneven under her feet. Someone bumped her shoulder from behind, a man in a hurry, and she sidestepped without losing her direction. He saw her when she was about 20 feet away. She knew it was him knowing it was her because of the way he went absolutely still for 1 second. Not frozen, not shocked, but still in the way of a person whose brain has just caught up to something it was already certain of. Then he started walking toward her, and they met somewhere in the middle of the platform, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He was older looking than she'd imagined, which was not an insult. He looked like someone who'd done real work in real weather, which she'd known, but imagining it and seeing it were different. There were lines around his eyes. His hands, she noticed, were exactly as scarred as he'd described. "Vivian Hartwell," he said. His voice was lower than she'd pictured it, steadier. "Silas Mercer," she said. They stood there looking at each other for a moment that lasted about twice as long as was socially conventional, and neither of them seemed to know exactly what to do with their hands. "You're real," he said. It came out before he could stop it, and he looked briefly like he regretted the lack of polish. She didn't. "So are you," she said. He looked at her bag. "Is this all you brought?" "My trunks are in the freight car." "Right." He put his hat back on. "I'll get them." He turned and walked toward the freight car with the focused efficiency of a man who needs something to do with himself. And Vivian stood on the platform and pressed her lips together and breathed. Her heart was going faster than was comfortable. She was aware of a shaking in her hands that she was controlling by keeping them still and flat against her sides. Everything she'd been certain of for 2 years was currently in the process of becoming real, and that was, it turned out, genuinely terrifying. He came back with both trunks on a 2-wheeled cart, handling them without visible effort. He looked at her books-heavy trunk and said, "What's in here?" "Books." He stopped, looked at her. "How many books?" "A reasonable number." "How reasonable?" "The number I decided I needed." He held her gaze for a second, and then, unexpectedly, and with a quality she hadn't quite been prepared for, he smiled. Not a polished smile, not a performance of warmth, just a smile, quick and genuine, that arrived and disappeared almost before she'd registered it. "I have a bookcase," he said. "It's going to need another one." "I know how to build things," she said. "I helped my father set up the print shop when I was 12. He looked at her for a moment in a way she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "The wagon's this way." The ride to the ranch took the better part of an hour. The road, if it deserved the name, was a pair of wheel tracks through the grass, and the wagon moved through the prairie afternoon with the horse's rhythm and the creak of the wheels and the enormous silence of the Kansas sky pressing down on everything. They talked, not the flowing, effortless conversation of their letters. This was different. This was two people feeling their way toward each other in 3 dimensions after 2 years of 2 dimensions. There were pauses. There were moments where one of them said something and the other wasn't sure how to respond, and the wagon creaked through the gap. But they talked. "How was the journey?" he asked. "Long. Chicago smelled terrible." "It does." "Have you been?" "Once. Went to see my brother 3 years ago." He paused. "He thought I was crazy to come back." "What did you tell him?" "That he should come see the prairie in spring and then tell me that." He glanced at her sidelong. "He hasn't come." "Maybe he will." "Maybe." A pause. "How's your father?" "Better than I expected when I left. Worse than he was." She looked at her hands in her lap. "That's the honest answer. The honest answer's the right one." "He told me not to look back so much." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Smart man." "He is," she said. "It took me a while to see it clearly. You have to be a certain distance from someone sometimes before you can see them." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. She noticed that about him. The way he actually listened, didn't just wait for his turn to talk. It was something she'd inferred from the letters and was relieved to find true in person. The ranch came into view slowly, the way things emerge from flat landscape. First just a shape against the horizon, then details resolving as you approached. The barn, the fencing, the house, solid and square and more substantial than she'd allowed herself to imagine. And the porch. She saw the chairs from 50 yards away. 2 of them, side by side, facing west, just as he'd described them in his very first letter, the letter that had started all of this. The evening light was coming from that direction, low and orange gold, and it hit the porch full on, and the chairs sat in it like they'd been waiting. Which one of them had been? She didn't say anything about it. She wasn't sure she had words for it, not yet, and she had a compositor's respect for the weight of language and the danger of using it wrong. Some things needed to be felt before they were named. Silas pulled the wagon up near the barn and climbed down, tied the horse. He came around to her side and offered his hand to help her down, a practical gesture, not ceremonial, and she took it and stepped down onto Kansas ground for the first time. The ground was dry and firm and smelled of grass and dust and something else, something mineral and open she couldn't identify. The wind moved across it without apology. She stood there and looked at the house, at the porch, at the chairs. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from 2 years of reading him. The careful, waiting, honest look of a man who wanted the truth more than reassurance. "Show me the house," she said. He did. He walked her through it room by room, practically, pointing out what was finished and what wasn't, what worked and what needed work, where the problems were and what he planned to do about them. He didn't dress it up. The kitchen was functional but plain. The bedroom ceiling had a seam that had never quite sat right. The back wall of the main room had a window that let in a draft in winter that he'd been meaning to sort out. She asked questions, practical ones, about the well, about the winter fuel situation, about the nearest town and what it had. He answered them all, directly, without defensiveness, even when the answer was that something was worse than ideal. "You're not trying to sell me on it," she observed at one point. He looked at her. "You're already here," he said. "What would be the point?" She nodded slowly. "Right." They ended up on the porch as the light finished its slow collapse into dusk. She sat in the right chair. He sat in the left. The prairie stretched out before them in the last of the gold light, going on and on until it met the sky in a line so clean it looked deliberate. Neither of them said anything for a while. The silence was different from the silences in the wagon. This one was easier, had more air in it. "It's very big," she said finally. "The prairie?" "All of it." She looked out at it. "I knew that. I knew it intellectually, but knowing something and sitting in the middle of it are different." "Yeah," he said. "It takes time to get used to." "Did you get used to it?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "I just stopped being scared of it." She looked at him then, and he looked at her. And there was a moment between them that was complicated in the good way, the way that means two people are beginning to understand each other past the surface level. "The chair," she said. She couldn't help it. "What about it?" "You really did put it there before the house was finished." "Yes." "That's either very confident or very presumptuous," she said. He considered that for a moment. "Probably both," he admitted. "I was trying to be the first one." "And the second one?" "I'm working on it." She turned back to the horizon. The last of the light was going fast now. The sky was turning that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before dark, and the first stars were beginning to declare themselves in the east. She'd left everything she knew. She was sitting on a porch in Kansas with a man she knew and didn't know, in the middle of a landscape that dwarfed everything human, and she had no idea yet whether she'd made the right decision or a brave one, or a foolish one, or all three at once. Her hands were still in her lap, steady now. She stayed in the chair until it was fully dark. She slept badly the first night. This wasn't a surprise. She'd known it wouldn't be easy, had told herself so on the train, had tried to prepare for the particular disorientation of waking up somewhere completely unfamiliar. But knowing something in advance doesn't make the experience of it any less real when it arrives. The room Silas had given her was the smaller of the two bedrooms, which he'd prepared with the same practical care he seemed to bring to everything: clean bedding, a lamp on the small table, a hook on the wall for her coat. It was a room made comfortable by someone who understood function without particularly thinking about softness. There were no curtains on the window. She'd noticed that and said nothing. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a place she didn't know yet. The house settled in ways the Philadelphia house had never settled. Longer creaks, deeper shifts, the sound of the wind getting into places it had no business being. Somewhere distant, an animal called. She wasn't sure what kind. The sound was unfamiliar, and the unfamiliarity of it was its own small unease. She thought about her parents' house, about the specific sound the third step made going up the stairs, the one she'd learned to step over as a child and had stepped over on instinct every night for 29 years. She thought about the east window in her room that caught the morning light. She thought about the smell of her mother's bread on Saturdays and her father's pipe in the evenings on the front step. She didn't cry. She was clear-eyed enough about herself to know that if she started, she'd have trouble stopping, and she wasn't going to spend her first night in Kansas crying because that wasn't who she was, and she'd rather be uncomfortable than be that. She got up before dawn. Silas was already awake. She could smell coffee before she reached the kitchen, and when she pushed through the door, he was at the stove, his back to her, stirring something in a heavy pot. He'd clearly been up for a while. He was already in his work clothes, his hair damp from washing. He heard her and turned, looked at her for a moment with the honest, assessing look she was starting to recognize as his resting expression. Not unfriendly, just attentive. "Sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was true enough. He turned back to the stove without making anything of it. "Coffee's done. Oatmeal in a few minutes." She poured herself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the prairie in the early light. It was different at dawn. The light came from the wrong direction compared to Philadelphia, or felt like it did, coming up from behind the house and laying long shadows westward across the grass. The sky was turning a pale, clear gray pink that was actually beautiful, and she stood there with her coffee and admitted that to herself while also feeling, simultaneously, like someone who had jumped from a height and hadn't finished falling yet. "I didn't sleep either," Silas said from the stove. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was reporting weather conditions. "Why not?" "Same reason you didn't, probably." He didn't turn around. Too much to think about. She drank her coffee and said nothing. There was something in that admission, offered without ceremony, without any apparent need for her to comfort him about it, that steadied her slightly. The oatmeal was plain and a little thick, but she ate it without complaint because she was hungry, and because she understood that a man living alone on the frontier for 2 years had not developed complicated cooking habits, and that was not a character flaw. After breakfast, he showed her the farm. Not a formal tour. He had work to do, and he did it while she walked alongside him and paid attention. He moved through his days with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of someone who has learned that the land operates on its own schedule, and you adjust to it rather than the other way around. He checked the horses first, running his hands along the legs of the one that had been lame in August, checking the hoof, satisfied with what he found. He talked to the horses the way she'd noticed some people talk to animals, not babying them, just communicating, brief and direct. "What are their names?" she asked. He looked at her like this was a mildly odd question. "The bay is Judge. The gray is Lincoln." "Because he's melancholy?" Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Because he's tall," he said. She looked at Lincoln, who was indeed notably tall, and was currently gazing at the middle distance with the expression of a horse who had seen many human plans come and go. "Fair enough," she said. They walked the fence line on the south side of the property, Silas checking the posts and wire, while Vivian kept pace and looked at everything. The land was not what she'd expected. She'd known it was flat, but flat didn't capture what was actually happening. It was more like the land had been smoothed intentionally, worked at by some enormous patient force until all the inconvenient variations had been resolved, and what remained was just pure, uninterrupted distance. It should have felt monotonous. Instead, it felt like a held breath. "How much land?" she asked. "Filed on 160. Got another 80 fenced on the north side that I've been developing." She'd read enough about the Homestead Act to understand the broad mechanics, but reading about something and standing in the middle of it made the numbers feel different. 160 acres of this. She looked out at the fence line running east and then tried to estimate where it ended and couldn't. "What grows well here?" she asked. "Wheat mostly. Sorghum. I've been testing some winter wheat varieties for the past 2 seasons." He paused at a post, tested it with both hands, found it solid. "Good years and bad years. Last summer was dry." "How dry?" "Lost about a third of the wheat." "And you're still—" She gestured vaguely at the farm, meaning still viable, still here. "Margins are tight," he said. He said it without apparent distress, just as information. "You plan for bad years. Put something back in the good ones. It's not complicated. It's just never comfortable." She filed that away alongside everything else she was filing, building her picture of this place and what it would actually require. She'd been practical about it, as practical as you could be from 1,000 miles away with only letters to go on, but practical from a distance and practical on the ground were different categories. "I want to know how it works," she said. "All of it, not just the house." He looked at her sideways as they walked. "I know you do. I'm not going to be useful to you if I don't understand what I'm working with." "I know that too." "I'm not saying it to be impressive," she said, aware that it might have sounded that way. "I'm saying it because it matters to me that I actually contribute and not just Vivian." He said it simply, not cutting her off so much as landing her. "I know. I've known since your 3rd letter." He kept walking. "I'll teach you everything. Just ask when you want to know something." She stopped analyzing it and walked. The first real friction came on the 4th day, which was sooner than either of them would have liked, but later than it might have been, given 2 very particular personalities occupying a very small house. It came from a practical matter, as the important arguments often do. She'd been looking at his account books. He'd offered them to her without hesitation, which she'd appreciated, and she'd found a discrepancy. Not a dramatic one, not dishonesty or error, just a system of record-keeping that had a gap in it. He tracked his expenses and his income, but he wasn't accounting for the cost of his own labor when he calculated the value of improvements he'd made to the property. It meant his understanding of his own financial position was slightly off in a way that could lead to bad planning. She brought it up at dinner. She tried to bring it up carefully, framing it as a question rather than a correction, because she'd spent enough time in professional environments dominated by men to know how to approach a point without provoking a defensive reaction. Silas listened. He looked at the book where she'd marked the relevant columns. He looked at her numbers in the margin, which she'd done in pencil, which seemed like the right call for someone correcting the record-keeping of a man she'd known for 4 days. "I've been doing it this way for 2 years, he said. "I know. It's made sense so far. It makes sense in the short term, she said. But if you're going to expand, which you've talked about wanting to do, you need to know the real cost basis. Otherwise, you're not comparing like with like. He looked at the book for a moment. She watched him process it. She could actually see him doing it, working through it, checking her reasoning against his own understanding. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't dismiss things. He didn't agree easily either. He actually thought. The labor time is inconsistent, he said. Some seasons I'm putting in more hours than others. Hard to assign a fixed number. You don't need a fixed number. You need an estimate. An estimate that's approximate is still better than nothing, because nothing is implying zero, and zero is wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn this? Running my father's shop for a year. She met his eyes. He'd been doing it a similar way, tracking transactions without tracking time. I changed it. And we found out 2 of our accounts were unprofitable because the work they required cost more than what they paid. We dropped them. The shop did better. He looked at the book again. Then he closed it, pushed it toward her slightly. Fix it, he said. Show me the system when you're done. It was not a gracious concession. He wasn't the type for gracious concessions. But it was a real one, and she respected it more for being ungracious. All right, she said. He picked up his fork and went back to eating. She did the same. The fire made its sounds in the stove. The wind ran its hand along the outside of the house the way the Kansas wind did, constantly and without apology. You always this direct? He asked, after a while. Pretty much, she said. Does that bother you? He considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give to all questions. No, he said. I asked for someone direct. Be strange to complain about it now. Some people say they want a thing and then are surprised by the reality of it. I'm aware. He looked at her across the table. I'm not some people. She held his gaze. No, she said. You're not. The following week, Holt Granger came by. He arrived on a Tuesday morning while Vivian was out on the porch with a cup of coffee and a letter she was composing to her mother. She heard the horse before she saw it, looked up, and watched a large man ride in from the north, dismount near the barn, and tie his horse with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times on this specific post. Silas came out from the barn a moment later, and the 2 men spoke briefly before walking toward the house. Holt saw her on the porch and took his hat off. Not with ceremony, but with the automatic reflex of a man with particular manners. This is Holt Granger, Silas said, when they reached the porch steps. My neighbor. He's known me since I filed the claim, which means, Holt said, settling his hat back on, that I've watched him be stubborn about a great many things for a long time. He extended his hand to Vivian, and his handshake was brief and firm. Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Mercer, soon enough, Silas said, which was the first time he'd said it out loud, and the simple plainness of it made something shift in Vivian's chest in a way she decided not to examine too closely in present company. Holt looked at her with frank curiosity, the kind of look that at least had the virtue of being honest about what it was. He looked at Silas, then back at her. Something in his expression settled. Well, he said. He said you were real. He was right, she said. He usually is, Holt said without apparent resentment. That's the annoying part. They had coffee on the porch, the 3 of them, and Vivian listened more than she spoke while Silas and Holt moved through the kind of conversation that men who've worked alongside each other in difficult conditions develop. Efficient, slightly encoded, full of references she didn't have context for yet. She noted things. The way Silas's posture changed around Holt, slightly less guarded. The way Holt glanced at her occasionally, including her without forcing her in. At one point, Holt said, Mercer told me you ran a print shop. My father's shop, yes, for about a year. And before that, you set the type yourself. For 11 years. Holt absorbed that. There's no printer in this county, he said. Nearest one's 20 miles east. Vivian looked at him. I know, she said. Silas mentioned it. Just making conversation, Holt said. But he said it with a slight quality she'd come to recognize in certain kinds of men. The kind who made a point of saying just making conversation when they were, in fact, making a point. After Holt left, she went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the room, the practical, slightly worn at the edges room that was going to be her kitchen, she supposed. along with everything else here. Silas came in behind her. She could feel him in the doorway before she heard him. He approved, Silas said. In case you were wondering. I wasn't. A little bit you were. She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with an expression that was the closest thing she'd seen to him being amused. His opinion isn't what matters, she said. No, he agreed, but it doesn't hurt. She sat down at the table. There's no printer in this county. No. Nearest one is 20 miles east. Holt mentioned that. He sat down across from her. Did you catch what he was getting at? He wasn't being subtle. He never is. She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about her compositing tools, wrapped in cloth in the trunk in the bedroom, packed on instinct. She thought about what it would take, practically, the equipment, the space, the paper supply, the clientele. She thought about the county with no printer. She thought about a woman who'd spent 11 years being the most skilled person in a room and then went west and became a farmer's wife. She wasn't sure how she felt about any of it, and she was honest enough with herself to sit with that uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely. It's a thought, she said. It's a good thought, Silas said. He said it without pushing. Just set it down between them like something they could look at later. The matter of the wedding came up on the 10th day, practical and slightly awkward. The way practical matters become awkward when they carry too much weight. They were eating dinner. She'd made it that night, a version of a stew her mother made that she'd adapted for what was available, which was less than ideal but produced something edible. When Silas said without preamble, I've been thinking about how we should do it, she looked up. The wedding? Yes. He looked mildly uncomfortable, which was rare enough to be notable. I don't want to push for a timeline that you're not ready for. But practically speaking, you're living here and the county. I understand the practical situation, she said. I'm not just talking about the practical situation. She set down her spoon. Then say what you mean. He met her eyes. He did that. When something was hard, he met your eyes, which she'd come to understand was the tell for when he was making an effort. I want to marry you, he said. Not because you're here and it's the right thing to do. Because I've wanted to for a long time, and that hasn't changed, now that you're real and sitting across from me eating dinner in my kitchen. There was nothing wrong with that. Nothing polished about it either. It landed with the weight of something said by someone who meant it and wasn't sure how it was going to be received. I've been here 10 days, she said. I know. I need a little more time. He nodded immediately. No argument, no wounded dignity. Just, all right. 2 more weeks, she said. If that's 2 weeks is fine, he said. Or 3, or more if you need it. She picked her spoon back up. They ate. The stew was not quite her mother's version, but it was close enough to make her feel something she didn't put a name to. It's a good stew, he said. It's missing something. I couldn't find the right spice in what you have. What do you need? Something called marjoram. It's possible the general store has it. I'll check Friday. She looked at him across the table. This man who had built a house and put 2 chairs on the porch and written her honest letters for 2 years and told her she had 2 weeks or 3 or as much as she needed, all in the same flat, steady voice he used for everything. Silas, she said. Yeah. 2 weeks is fine, she said. He looked at her steadily. Okay, he said, and went back to his stew. In the last days before the wedding, she learned 3 things about Kansas that nobody had told her. The first was that the silence was not actually silence. She'd assumed it would be quiet. Coming from Philadelphia, she'd been braced for the absence of city noise as a kind of deprivation, a thing to get used to. But the prairie was not silent. It was full of its own sounds, the grass moving in the wind, which was a constant layered murmur, the insects, the birds she hadn't learned to name yet, the deep, low creak of the house at night. It wasn't the human noise of the city, but it wasn't nothing, and she found herself listening to it with something like attention. The second was that the work was more interesting than she'd expected. She'd anticipated difficulty. The physical reality of frontier life had always been clear to her, but she hadn't anticipated finding the problems genuinely engaging. The well drainage issue Silas had been trying to solve for 2 seasons became something she sat with for 2 evenings, thinking through it the way she thought through typesetting problems. and she came up with a modification to the diversion channel that he said was actually better than what he'd been planning. He said it without fanfare, just looked at her diagram and said, and went to implement it, and she sat with the satisfaction of that for a day. The third thing she learned was that Silas was afraid of one thing she hadn't known about: failure. Not dramatic failure, not catastrophe. He was calm about those, genuinely. But the quiet, grinding kind, the kind where you work hard and do everything right, and the land still doesn't give you what you need, and you have to look at someone who trusted you and say it wasn't enough. She saw it in him one evening when he was working the figures for next year's planting. A stillness in him that was different from his usual stillness. Something tighter. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Running the numbers for spring." "And?" He looked up. He had that look again. The one that meant he was going to tell her something true. "If next summer's as dry as last summer, we're going to be in a difficult position." "How difficult?" "Might have to take a bank loan, which I haven't had to do. Which I don't—" He stopped. "Which you don't want to ask me to tolerate," she said. He looked at her. "Something like that." She moved to the table, sat down across from him. "Show me the numbers." "Vivian, show me the numbers, Silas." She held out her hand for the ledger. He gave it to her. She read it carefully, turned 3 pages, read them too. It wasn't as bad as his face had suggested. He had a tendency, she was discovering, to feel the weight of a problem fully before he'd worked it through, which meant his first assessment of something was often grimmer than the reality. "Your worst case is uncomfortable, not catastrophic," she said. "Uncomfortable is relative." "True, but you're not accounting for the income from the Southfield acreage you're adding. That changes the risk profile." "That field isn't producing yet. But it will be by summer. You told me yourself the soil composition is better down there." She turned the ledger to face him, pointed to the column. "If you assume even a conservative yield," she wrote a number in the margin. "This is your actual position, not ideal, but manageable." He looked at the number. He looked at her. "You're going to do this, aren't you?" he said. "Look at all the problems and take them apart." "Is that a complaint?" He sat back in his chair. "No," he said. "I'm just getting used to it." "You said you wanted a partner," she said. "You said that in the first letter, not a housekeeper, a partner." "I did say that." "I'm being a partner." He looked at her across the table, and whatever he was thinking, it was something he didn't say. He just nodded and took the ledger back and started writing in the numbers she'd suggested. She went back to her book. The fire settled in the stove. The wind moved across the roof. She was 11 days from her wedding. She was 6 weeks from Philadelphia. She was sitting in a kitchen in Kansas with a man she'd decided to trust with her life, correcting his figures with a pencil. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that would have been impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it, was that it felt less strange than she'd feared and more right than she'd allowed herself to hope. Not perfect. Not the clean, resolved feeling of something finished. More like the feeling of something that had started, that was underway, moving, not quite in focus yet, but real. She turned a page. Outside, a coyote called once in the dark and went quiet. The house creaked and held. She read until the lamp burned low, and then she went to bed, and she slept. They were married on a Friday in October, 3 weeks after Vivian stepped off the train. The ceremony was small. The county judge, Holt Granger as witness, and a woman named Edna Paulson, who was Holt's nearest neighbor, and had attached herself to the occasion with the cheerful authority of someone who understood that events needed managing. She'd brought a cake, which nobody had asked for, but everybody was grateful for, because the alternative was nothing, and nothing seemed like the wrong register. The judge read the legal language quickly and without embellishment, which suited both of them. Silas said what he was supposed to say in a flat, certain voice that didn't waver. Vivian said the same, looking at him directly, and meant every word of it in the practical, undecorated way she meant the things she committed to. Holt shook Silas's hand afterward, and then, surprising everyone, including himself, shook Vivian's. "Welcome to Kansas," he said. "I've been here 3 weeks," she said. "Now you're staying," he said. "That's different." Edna cried a little, which she apologized for and then did anyway. She told Vivian that the ranch would be beautiful in the spring and that Silas had been a good neighbor for 2 years, and that she hoped Vivian would come to the women's sewing circle on Thursday afternoons, which met at the Hendersons' farm. I don't sew particularly well, Vivian said. Neither does anyone else, Edna said pleasantly. That's not really what it's for. They drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon, Silas and Vivian, the same way they'd come back from the station 3 weeks ago. The light was different, colder, lower, the sky a pale winter-approaching blue that had none of September's warmth. The grass had shifted from gold to something closer to brown. The prairie looked stripped down, elemental, as if it had taken everything unnecessary off in preparation for the season ahead. They didn't talk much on the ride back. It wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who'd already said the important things and didn't need to fill the space around them with more words. She looked at the land. He drove. When they got home, she sat in her chair on the porch for a while, even though it was cold enough that she could see her breath. She wasn't sure why, exactly. It seemed like the right place to be. Silas came out after a few minutes with her coat, which she'd left inside. He handed it to her without comment, and she put it on, and he went back inside. She sat there until the cold made it impractical, and then she went in. The first winter was the most difficult thing she'd experienced in her life, and she was not someone who'd had an easy life. It came hard in November, harder than the previous 2 winters, Silas said, though he said it without complaint, just as calibration. The temperature dropped fast, and the wind that had been a constant companion became something different, not moving air, but a force with intent, something that found every gap in the house and worked at it relentlessly. The draft from the back wall window that Silas had meant to fix became not a minor inconvenience but an actual problem, and they fixed it together over 2 days using a method Vivian had read about in a pamphlet she'd picked up at the general store, which worked better than Silas's original plan, a fact he acknowledged without ceremony. The isolation was the hardest part. She hadn't anticipated how total it would be. In Philadelphia, even alone, she'd been surrounded by the hum of other lives, other people's noise and movement and presence. Here, in winter, the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and some weeks the weather made even that distance impassable. There were days when the only humans she spoke to were Silas, and on the rare occasions when he rode to town, herself. She wrote letters, long ones to her mother, to Eleanor, to Margaret. She wrote to Thomas about the shop, partly out of genuine interest in its progress, and partly because the act of thinking about it kept a part of her mind exercised that the frontier didn't always use. She also started a journal, not a sentimental one. She wasn't built for sentiment in the diary form. It was more of a record, observations about the land, the weather patterns, the farm's operations. She started tracking things Silas hadn't tracked, not because he was careless, but because he'd been alone, and the things she noticed were the things a second set of eyes noticed. She wrote down which fence sections showed stress in the cold. She wrote down the way the snow drifted against the north barn wall, which suggested the drainage arrangement was pushing water in the wrong direction in the thaw. She wrote down ideas. Some evenings after dinner, she read pieces of it to Silas, not asking for his approval, just sharing the way they'd shared in letters, the flow of thinking out loud. He listened. He pushed back sometimes when he disagreed, and they argued it through in the way that was becoming their particular form of conversation. No softening, no politeness for its own sake, but no cruelty either. Just two people trying to figure out what was true. One evening in December, she read him her notes on the printer problem. It had been sitting in the back of her mind since Holt's comment, growing when she gave it attention, refusing to go away when she tried to set it aside. She'd done what she always did with something she was taking seriously. She'd researched it, thought it through, tried to break it. The notes in her journal were 12 pages long. She summarized them. The county population, which she'd gotten from the land office, the nearest printing establishment, and its distance. The types of printing work a county like this would need: legal forms, land office documents, the county paper, which was currently being printed 20 miles away and arrived late and sometimes not at all. The commercial printing that went entirely unmet, business letterhead, notices, records. Silas listened through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need to set it up?" he asked. She'd been ready for skepticism. The directness of the question landed without warning. "The press itself is the largest expense," she said. "There are second-hand options. I've been in contact with a supplier in Chicago. I wrote him in October. He has a small hand press that would serve for a start." "How much?" She told him. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing the math. "That's not nothing." "No, she agreed. It's not. But it's possible. It's possible, she said, if the spring planting is reasonable. He looked at her. Where would you set it up? The east room of the barn. It's not being used for anything structural. It would need a wood floor and better insulation, but that's a few weeks of work. You've been planning this for a while, he said. Not accusatory, just noticing. Since about the second week, she said. He almost smiled. The bookshelf wasn't enough. The bookshelf was a starting point. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. She watched him think. She'd gotten good at reading the quality of his silences, which were many and various. This one was not negative. It was the working through silence, the one he made when he was turning something over and seeing which way it landed. If you want to do it, he said finally, we'll find a way to do it. I want to do it. Then we'll find a way. She looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, something about what it meant, that he'd said it that simply, without the three-step process of male professional validation she'd had to navigate for 11 years in the print shop. She didn't say it. She wrote it in her journal later that night instead, because some things were clearer when you wrote them down. The winter broke in March, the way Kansas winters broke. Suddenly, without apology. As if the cold had simply lost interest and left. The snow went fast, the ground came up muddy and dark, and within 2 weeks the first green was pushing through in the south field. Silas worked from before dawn to after dark during planting season, and Vivian worked alongside him. She'd been honest with herself about the gap in her physical condition relative to the work. She was strong. She'd always been strong, but print shop strong and farm strong were different categories. And the first weeks of planting season in her first Kansas spring cost her something. Her back ached in ways she hadn't known backs could ache. Her hands, already ink calloused, developed new calluses in new places. She went to bed some nights and fell asleep with her boots still on, which would have horrified her Philadelphia self. She didn't complain. This was partly stubbornness, and partly because Silas didn't complain either, and she wasn't going to be the person who flinched first. One evening in April, when they were both on the porch after a day that had started before sunrise, she looked at her hands and said, I didn't know it was this physical. You read about it, he said. Reading and doing are different things. You said that yourself, sort of. I said the prairie was different in person than in description. Same principle. She flexed her fingers. The skin was rough. There was a cut on her right palm that was healing slowly because it kept getting reopened. I'm not complaining. I know you're not. I'm just noting it. Noted, he said. He looked at her hands, then he got up, went inside, came back with a small tin. He handed it to her. Lanolin, he said, for the cuts. Should have given it to you sooner. She looked at the tin. Thank you. You could have asked. I didn't know to ask. Fair, sir, he said. He sat back down. For what it's worth, you've kept up. Better than I expected. She looked at him. Should I be flattered or insulted? Flattered, he said. My expectation was high. She opened the tin and started working the lanolin into her hands. The prairie evening was cool and smelled of turned earth and new grass, and the light was doing the Kansas thing where it turned gold and enormous before giving up. A meadowlark was going somewhere to the north, the same four-note phrase over and over. Spring is better, she said. Then what? Then winter. Then what I expected. She looked out at the south field where the young wheat was showing in rows, pale green and fragile looking. That's ours. Yeah, we planted that. We did. She sat with that for a moment. She'd planted things in her mother's small back garden as a child, the ordinary domestic variety of growing things. This was different. There was something in the scale of it, the investment of the work, that made the green rose feel personal in a way she hadn't anticipated. I want to write to my mother, she said. Tell her about the field. Write to her. Tomorrow. Too tired tonight. Same, he said. They sat in their chairs while the light went, which was a thing they did most evenings now, the way things become habit when two people share a space and find something that works. Neither of them had said anything about it being a habit. It just was. The letter from Thomas arrived in May. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, Silas already out in the fields. Thomas wrote that the shop was doing well, better than well, actually, A new contract with a dry goods supplier for their catalog work had come in, and the volumes were up 15% from this time last year. He wrote about her father, who had been coming to the shop 3 mornings a week and had, apparently, formed an opinion about the new typeface Thomas had ordered and was making his opinions known, which Thomas reported with a tone that was equal parts exasperation and relief. Her father's opinions meant her father was present. Presence meant recovery. She read that part twice. Then she sat for a while with the letter in her hands and looked out the window at the Kansas spring, at the field she could just see from this angle, at the sky that was doing nothing remarkable but was, as always, enormous. She thought about the print shop, about the smell of ink and paper and the particular quality of focused noise in a working shop. She thought about Thomas managing it, managing her father's opinions about typefaces, managing the catalog contract. She thought about the fact that it was running without her, and that this was exactly what she'd planned, and that the plan had worked. She thought about what was here: the farm, the journals, the bookshelf that needed the second one, the East barn room, which Silas had already started framing out, the county with no printer. She put Thomas's letter in the box with Silas's old letters next to her parents' photograph. Silas came in for water at midday and found her at the table with the journal open, writing. He filled his cup and drank it standing, the way he did at midday when he was in the middle of something. "Good letter?" he asked. "Good letter," she said. "Shop is doing well. My father's forming opinions about typefaces." "That's good, isn't it?" "It's very good." She looked up. "The East room. How long before it's ready?" He thought about it. "Another 3 weeks. Maybe 2 if the weather cooperates." "Then I want to write to the Chicago supplier," she said. "About the press." He drank the rest of his water, set the cup down. "Write to him," he said. She nodded and went back to her journal. He went back to the field. The house settled around her, familiar now in its specific sounds and its specific light, the way a place becomes familiar when you've spent a winter in it and a spring. Outside, the wheat grew in rows. In the East barn, the framing was going up for a room that didn't exist yet. In a box under the bed, 44 letters sat in order, the architecture of everything that had brought them here. And on the porch, facing west, the 2 chairs waited in the afternoon light, occupied now most evenings by 2 people who were figuring out, in the imperfect and ongoing way of real things, what it actually meant to build a life on purpose. Not smoothly, not without argument or exhaustion or the ordinary difficulty of 2 stubborn people in close quarters over a long winter, but steadily. The way you work a piece of land, but not because it's easy, but because you've decided it's worth it, and you keep showing up. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. The press arrived in June, packed in 3 crates on the back of a freight wagon, and it was heavier than Vivian had anticipated and more beautiful than she'd remembered. She stood in the East barn room, floored now, insulated, the smell of new wood still sharp in the air, and watched Silas and Holt maneuver the main casting into position and felt something she hadn't felt in nearly a year, the specific anticipation of work she was genuinely good at, on her own terms, in her own space. "Where exactly?" Silas asked, from under one end of it. "Center of the room, facing east." "Any particular reason for east?" "Morning light," she said, "and I like the direction." Holt from the other end made a sound that might have been a laugh. They set it down where she said, "It took her 2 weeks to get the press operational. Not because she was slow, but because setting up a print shop from raw components required a particular sequence of patience, and she'd learned over 11 years that rushing the setup meant paying for it later." She ordered type from the same Chicago supplier. She sourced paper from a warehouse in Kansas City that Silas tracked down through a contact at the land office. She wrote to the county clerk and the local land office, and 3 businesses in town explaining what she was offering. The first job came in before the press was even fully operational. The county clerk needed 200 copies of a land survey notification form. She set the type, ran the proof, corrected 2 errors, ran the job. When she pulled the first clean copy off the press and held it to the light, she stood alone in her barn room for a moment with the smell of fresh ink around her and something in her chest that was very close to the feeling of being entirely herself. She was 30 years old. She had ink on her hands again, the permanent kind, and she was glad of it. That summer was better than the previous one. Not easy. The land didn't do easy, and she'd long since stopped expecting it to. but better. The winter wheat came in well enough. The south field, the one she'd seen as fragile green rows in April, produced a yield that fell on the right side of Silas's careful projections. There was no money to spare, but there was no crisis either, and on the frontier in 1882 that counted as a good year. The print shop grew steadily, the way things grow when the need for them was there all along, and you've simply supplied it. The county paper contracted her to print their weekly run, which kept the press occupied and the income regular. Businesses came. Legal work came. Holt, who had apparently been waiting for this with more investment than he'd let on, brought her a job printing seed catalogs for a cooperative of 5 farms he'd organized, which was the largest single job she'd run and which she managed without sleeping much for a week and completed without error. Silas looked at the finished catalogs one evening, neat stacks of them, smelling of ink, waiting for pickup. "How many?" he asked. 300 copies. He picked one up, turned it over, looked at the print quality with the serious attention he gave to anything that had been made well. "Good," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I wasn't surprised." "I know that too," she said. They had their first child in the spring of 1883. A boy, which surprised neither of them particularly, though Vivian had a private and completely irrational conviction it would be a girl. They named him Arthur, after her father, who received the letter announcing it and apparently sat in the kitchen for a long time before being able to write back. His response arrived 6 weeks later in the slightly uneven handwriting of his still recovering right hand, 3 lines, which for Arthur Hartwell was the equivalent of a speech. "A boy named Arthur. Your mother is already planning to come visit. I am told I am not well enough to travel. I am planning to come anyway." He did come the following September, accompanied by Margaret, who had made the decision with the fixed, practical efficiency of a woman who had decided something and was not going to be argued out of it. They came by train, the same route Vivian had taken 2 years before, and Silas met them at the station with the wagon. And when Vivian saw her mother step onto the platform, she felt a complicated rush of something she didn't fully have words for. The collision of her old life and her new one, standing on the same piece of ground. Her mother looked at the ranch with the careful, assessing eye of a woman who was building an opinion and intended to be honest about it. She looked at the house, the fields, the east barn, the porch with its 2 chairs, now worn smooth with use, facing the western horizon. She looked at Vivian. "You look different," her mother said. "I'm the same," Vivian said. "No," her mother said. "You're not." She said it the way she said things she meant, simply, without decoration. "You look like yourself." Vivian didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. Her father held the baby with his left arm, the good one, and looked at the prairie the way a man looks at something he's been trying to imagine for 2 years and has finally gotten wrong in all the specific ways you can only discover in person. He stayed for 3 weeks. He and Silas, who had never met before and had no particular reason to trust each other immediately, spent a surprising amount of time in each other's company. Her father watching Silas work with the focused attention of a man who was evaluating, and Silas treating that evaluation with the steady indifference of someone who had nothing to hide and no energy for performance. On the last evening before her parents left, Vivian found her father on the porch. He'd gotten himself into one of the chairs without asking for help, which was something he did. Insisted on managing physical tasks himself even when it cost him, because the alternative was worse. He was looking west. She sat in the other chair. Young Arthur was asleep inside, and the prairie evening was quiet and enormous and completely itself. "You chose well," her father said after a while. She knew he meant both things, the man and the place. "I know," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You always knew?" "No," she said honestly. "I hoped. For a long time I just hoped." He nodded. "That's brave," he said. "Hoping when you don't know." She thought about the letter, the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the line about the second chair that she'd read at a work table with ink under her fingernails, on a Tuesday in November that had looked like every other Tuesday until it didn't. She thought about the 11 days it had taken Silas to write an honest account of himself, and the hours she'd spent writing back, and the 34 letters that had crossed the country between them before she'd stepped onto a train. "It wasn't bravery," she said. "Not exactly. It was, I got tired of waiting for my life to arrive. I decided to go get it." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have told you that sooner." "You told me eventually," she said. "Too late." "Not too late," she said. "I'm here." He looked out at the prairie. The sun was going the way it went out here, fast and golden and total, the sky cycling through its colors like it was in a hurry to get somewhere. He watched it for a while. "I'm glad I came," he said. "I'm glad too." His left hand moved on the arm of the chair, the small gesture that meant something he wasn't going to put into more words. She understood it. She'd grown up reading him. They sat there until the light was gone. The years that followed were the kind that build a life without announcing themselves as anything particular. They moved in accumulation, the way real things do. Not in dramatic arcs, but in seasons, in decisions, in the gradual accrual of what you've made and what you've lost and what you've kept. The farm expanded. The south field came fully into production. A third field came under cultivation the year Arthur turned 4, when a neighboring claim went unsettled and Silas moved quickly, as he sometimes did when the decision was clear. The finances went from tight to manageable to, by 1887, something closer to stable. Not wealthy, nothing like that, but the kind of stable where a bad year was a problem you could absorb rather than a catastrophe that took everything. The print shop became what Vivian had seen in it from the beginning, a real business with real work and real accounts. She hired a young man named Robert Fletcher to run the press when Arthur was born, and she couldn't manage everything alone. And Robert was competent and reliable and seemed to understand without being told that the woman who had built the shop was not a figurehead, but the actual center of the operation. She was 33 when she took on her first apprentice, a girl, 15, whose family had homesteaded north of town. The girl's name was Clara, not the Clara Henderson of Silas's old neighbor's concern, but another one, and Vivian took that coincidence as nothing in particular and taught her everything she knew. They had 2 more children after Arthur, a girl in 1885 named Ruth, and another boy in 1888 named Henry, who came early and scared everyone and then refused to die, which seemed to establish his character early. The children grew up in a house with a serious amount of books, and 2 parents who argued productively about most things and showed them, without meaning to, what it looked like when 2 people took each other seriously. Arthur Hartwell died in 1889, in the spring, in his sleep, which was a decent way to go and which her mother said was exactly the kind of exit he would have chosen if he'd been offered a choice. Vivian got the letter on a Thursday and sat with it for a long time before she told Silas, who sat with her and said nothing, which was what she needed him to do and which he understood without being told. She went back to Philadelphia for the funeral. She went alone. The children were too young for the journey, and Silas had the spring planting, and she didn't want him to come. Not for bad reasons, but because this was her grief and her family, and she needed to move through it in her own way. She spent 2 weeks with her mother in the house on the street she'd grown up on, and it was strange and necessary in the way of all the important things she'd done. The house was smaller than she remembered, or she was different. She walked through the rooms with the particular clarity of someone who has left a place and returned after years, seeing both what was there and what she'd carried away from it. She helped her mother sort her father's things. She sat with Margaret in the kitchen, and they didn't say much because after a certain point there isn't much to say, and they'd always understood each other best in the efficient, economical way of their family. On the last night before she left, she found her mother in the front parlor, sitting in the chair her father had always sat in, not reading, just sitting. "Come back with me," Vivian said. She'd said it before and expected the same answer. Her mother looked at her. "This is my house." "I know." "He built it." "I know, Mom." Her mother was quiet for a while. She looked around the room with its familiar furniture, its photographs, the particular quality of light that came through the east window in the morning. "Maybe in the fall," her mother said. Vivian looked at her. "Really?" "Maybe," her mother said firmly, which meant she was considering it, which was more than she'd ever said before. Margaret Hartwell came to Kansas the following October and stayed for 4 months, which was presented as a visit and was understood by everyone as a trial. She formed opinions about the prairie, which she expressed directly. She formed opinions about Silas, which she kept to herself, but which were legible to Vivian in the particular shorthand of their relationship. She held the grandchildren with the same economical affection she'd always had, and they adored her in the particular way children adore grandmothers who don't pretend. When spring came, she went back to Philadelphia, but she came back the following fall, and the fall after that, and eventually the visits stretched until they weren't really visits anymore, but a second life. And she sold the Philadelphia house in 1893 and moved west for good, at 61, which surprised everyone who knew her and surprised no one who understood what she was. The ranch became, over the years, the thing Silas had seen in it from the beginning. Not just a farm, but a place with a quality to it. The library grew as Vivian ordered books with the methodical passion of someone who believes deeply in the project of knowing things. The children were educated with a seriousness that the county school couldn't entirely supply, so Vivian supplied the rest herself, and then began supplying it for other children in the area as well. And what started as informal tutoring became something closer to a school 2 afternoons a week in the main room, which continued for 11 years and educated 43 children from 12 different families. Holt's daughter was one of them. He never said anything about it directly, but once, after a particularly long evening on the porch, he said to Silas, "She's changed things out here." Silas looked at him. "I know. The shop, the school, the—" Holt gestured vaguely. "The whole thing." "I know," Silas said again. "You could have married someone sensible," Holt said. "Clara Henderson, for instance. Nice woman. Would have been easier." "Probably," Silas said. But I didn't want easier," Silas said. "I wanted right." Holt considered that. "And it was? Right?" Silas looked out at the dark prairie. In the house behind them, through the window, they could hear Vivian's voice reading to the children. One of the older books, something with adventure in it. Her voice doing the characters differently, Arthur's laugh coming through clearly. "Yeah," Silas said, "it was right." He lived to 74, which was a decent age for a man who'd spent 40 years working land in Kansas weather. He slowed in his late 60s. The back that had ached in his 30s gave him serious trouble in his 60s, and he handed the physical management of the farm to Arthur, who'd grown into a version of his father that was both familiar and his own. Silas supervised and planned and argued with Arthur about methods the way he'd always argued about things, and Arthur argued back, which was as it should be. He died in the winter of 1922, at the end of January, in the house he'd built with his own hands. Vivian was with him. The last conversation between them was not remarkable, which was appropriate because they'd had the remarkable conversations over 40 years and didn't need to manufacture one at the end. He was tired. She was holding his hand. He looked at her for a long time with the same honest, attending look he'd had since the first day on the platform, the look that said he was actually seeing her. "Still right about the chairs?" he said. It came out rough, barely there, but she heard it. "Still right," she said. He closed his eyes. She found the letter 3 days after the funeral, going through the old desk he'd kept in the corner of the main room since the beginning. It was in the bottom drawer, under land documents and old correspondence, folded inside an envelope she recognized as the same kind he'd used in 1879. She opened it. It was the original draft of the advertisement, the one he'd written before the version that ran in the papers, rougher, longer, with crossings out and changed words visible in the margins. She read through it slowly, recognizing the sentences, the phrases she'd read 43 years ago at a work table in Philadelphia. At the bottom, below the famous line about the second chair, was something she hadn't seen before, added later in ink that was slightly different from the original, darker, put there years after the draft was written. She came. She sat in it. "I was right about the chairs." She stood in the main room of the house for a long time, holding the page. The house was quiet around her. It was a different quiet from the quiet of her first night here, 40 years ago. Not the silence of unfamiliarity, but the silence of a place fully known. She knew every sound it made. She knew the way the light came through the east window in the morning and the west window in the evening. She knew the smell of it in every season. Outside, the prairie was the same. That was the thing about the prairie. It outlasted everything. The same grass, the same sky, the same enormous, indifferent horizon. It had been there before them, and it would be there after. And somewhere in that continuity was something she'd stopped finding frightening and had come to find over 40 years something closer to comfort. She put on her coat and walked outside to the porch. She sat in her chair. The right one? Always the right one. the one that had been empty for 2 years before she filled it. The wood was worn smooth where her hands had rested thousands of times. The porch boards Silas had replaced the summer before she arrived were long since replaced again by Arthur and then by Arthur's son. The left chair was empty. She didn't cry. She'd done that in private in the 3 days since he died, and she'd do it again. But not right now. Right now she sat in her chair and looked at the horizon and thought about what they'd built. Not the farm, though the farm was real and good, not the print shop, which had become a proper business with its own staff and its own life. Not even the school, or the books, or the 43 children who'd sat in her main room on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and learned things they wouldn't have learned otherwise. She thought about the accumulation of days, the arguments and the silences and the hard winters, and the seasons when the crop came in, and the seasons when it didn't, and the letters in the box under the bed that she'd read through the previous evening, all 34 of them, the handwriting familiar and young-looking now, in the way of things from before you knew how things would turn out. She thought about a Tuesday in November in 1879, when she'd been 28 years old and had read something honest in a newspaper and had written back. She thought about her father saying, "Go and don't look back so much." She thought about the note at the bottom of the draft. She came, she sat in it, I was right. The thing about a life built deliberately. The thing she understood now, at 70, that she hadn't understood at 29 when she'd stepped off a train in Kansas, was that it didn't feel deliberate while you were living it. It felt like the ordinary muddle of days, of problems and repairs and conversations and failures and small victories. The deliberateness wasn't a quality you could feel in any given moment. It was something you could only see from the back end, looking at the shape of it whole. She'd chosen this. All of it. Not perfectly. Not without fear. Not without the nights when she'd lain awake wondering if she'd understood what she was doing. But she'd chosen it. That mattered. It was, she thought, the thing that mattered most. Not the outcome. Not whether it turned out to be right. But the act of choosing on purpose rather than letting things choose themselves. She sat on the porch until the evening light went gold and long, the way she'd been doing for 40 years. Young Arthur, her Arthur, who was 52 and a grandfather himself now, came out at one point and stood behind her with his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and then he went back inside. The sky cycled through its colors. The grass moved. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the south field. She stayed until it was nearly dark. Then she went inside, to the house that was still warm, to the family that was still there, carrying the letter with the note at the bottom, and she put it back in the desk drawer where it had lived, and she left it for whoever would find it next. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be kept.